All right, everybody, and welcome to the stream. It's so good to have you all today. My name is David McCarricker. I am the host here at Theory Underground, and today we're joined by the co-instructor of the Digital Literacy and Critical Media Theory course at Theory Underground, Anne Snellgrove. Welcome, Anne. And we have a very special guest. I guess I could say at this point a longtime friend of the channel because I interviewed you like I don't know a few years ago, and we've communicated since then. And so it's really good to have you back now for the first time on Theory Underground. Welcome, Andrew McLuhan.
Thanks, Dave, and everybody. We've known each other for a while now. It's a pleasure to be here for sure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's really great to have you. And so, for those who are not familiar with Andrew's work, much less the McLuhan name, I will do this short version of an introduction and then let you go a little more in depth here. But basically, I'll just say that Marshall McLuhan, Andrew's grandfather, is the one who's famously known for having said that the medium is the message. Something that I'm not really sure if that clicks for people. Like people say it, but I'm not really sure they understand how deep it really goes. But he wrote his magnum opus, Understanding Media. And then Eric, his son, has written some very important work continuing the McLuhan legacy, and I would call it the McLuhan way of seeing. And now, to this day, Andrew continues that work. And he does that with the McLuhan Institute. He does that with his writings. And specifically, the topic of today, a book that he has been serially posting or publishing to Substack, Maelstrom Strategies. Or is it Escape Strategies? Escape Strategies, yeah. Would you like to fill in some gaps here and let everyone know a little bit more about the McLuhan name and the project that you've been doing?
I'd be happy to. Marshall McLuhan was my grandfather. Here's a fun picture. That's Marshall in the middle with my uncle Michael beside him, and then my dad holding me. And I'm like two something years old there. That would have been Marshall's 69th birthday, probably. He died very young. He was 69 years old. Um, yeah, that's such a little treasure. Anyway, Marshall was my grandfather. Eric, he had six kids. My father, Eric, was the oldest of them. Michael, you saw there's the youngest, and then there's four girls in between. None of them really took up the work the way my dad did. My dad, he tried to avoid it, but ended up getting sucked into it in the end, I guess, as I have as well, funnily enough. My dad kind of ran off to join the Air Force. He was born in the U.S., was a U.S. citizen. My grandmother was a U.S. citizen from Texas. And my dad, the way he says it, he joined the Air Force rather than being drafted into the Army in Vietnam time. But I think he really just wanted to get out and go do something, and that was kind of convenient. He's always fascinated with airplanes, and he managed to get his pilot license and stuff. So he tried to get away from it, but while he was away, Understanding Media came out. Uh, he got interested in his dad's work, and when he came back from the Air Force, became Marshall's assistant and worked with him for the rest of his life. And assistant really isn't the word because they had a very special, close relationship. Marshall collaborated with a bunch of people over the years, but my father was really the closest. He was just such an intelligent person. And he and Marshall together discovered the laws of media. After Marshall passed in 1980, really unexpectedly, at age 69, my dad kind of kept going. But he was never interested in the spotlight. He was happy to be here. I'm in his old office, mine now. And he just wanted to be here reading books and exploring and making discoveries and writing about them, right? And you mentioned some of the work he did. Um, Marshall, I like to think of Marshall, well, he called himself an explorer. He said, I don't explain, I explore. Media studies were not really a thing. He's one of the pioneers of it. a new way of, not just seeing but perceiving. I think we need to go back. And it's funny you said seeing, but anyway, it's all about perception. Um, it's, all we know about the world comes through our senses. And Marshall was very aware of this. And back when he started working in understanding the effects of technologies on people and culture, there wasn't media studies wasn't a thing. He was in an English department, and usually communications studies were housed kind of adjacent to or within English departments because they were kind of related. Um, but what Marshall did that was different was he was looking beyond content, almost disregarding content uh, because there's a lot more that happens than just the content level of things. And so that was his focus. And it's kind of remarkable that he managed to do that, given that content was his business. He was an English teacher. He was trained in literary criticism and in poetry. And his entire career, he was an English teacher. Media studies was kind of his side hustle, which is funny. But
Yeah.
so yeah, my as I said, he considered himself a sort of explorer, and because it was such new territory, he did a lot of just frontier type work, looking at things, pointing things out, and I liken him to the cliche about icebergs that you only see like the fraction of thing that's at the top, and under the surface there's this large structure. Well, here's Marshall coming along, pointing out an iceberg here and an iceberg there, and kind of moving on, right? And leaving a lot of the development work for the rest of us to do. And that's
Mm.
what my dad did. My dad tied up a lot of loose ends, developed work, particularly with books like Media Informal Cause, which is a really deep book. I don't know if you've read that one, Dave, but
No, no, I have not.
so it's kind of funny. I'll dwell on that for a second because there's this term formal cause, and it comes from Aristotle. Aristotle identified four causes of things: the efficient cause, the material cause, the final cause, and the formal cause. And it's kind of funny. It's funny how we get work done, right? How we get onto different projects. A case of Media Informal Cause came in 2011. Um, there's an organization called the Media Ecology Association. They're kind of based out of New York, but they have, membership North America, kind of around the world now. They're largely academic organization. Anyway, um, what happened was people were using this term formal cause regarding media studies, and my dad was getting increasingly more and more annoyed because he felt they weren't really doing the term justice in the McLuhan sense of how we used the term. And um, so that spurred him on to doing an essay called Media Informal Cause, where he had to go back. This is the kind of scholar that my father was, okay? In order to get to the bottom of it, he didn't want to rely on translations, so he went back and taught himself Greek so
Oh
that
my
he
God.
could read the earlier texts. And this is where he found that things had gone wrong, is in the English translations, right? And when you go back to the Greek, you get something else.
Hmm.
And that to me is the pinnacle of scholarship.
Absolutely.
Don't take somebody's word for it, find it for yourself, right? That to me is just wild, but that's the kind of guy he was. So he went and he taught himself Greek so he could go back to the earliest texts that we have, to unravel this sort of thing about formal cause. And there's actually a video I put up on the McLuhan Institute YouTube page. So my dad came out with this book, Medium Formal Cause, and a year later, some of the people from the MEA put out something called, what is it, Taking Up McLuhan's Cause, which is kind of essays in response to my dad's essay and book. And they invited my dad to be respondent on the panel they did that year launching the book. And they all went through and did their things. And then my dad spent like half an hour very, very gently responding to it. And luckily for me, I pressed record on a voice note when he started speaking and recorded the whole thing. And it's just amazing because The book, the essay, Media and Formal Cause, is very, very scholarly, academic. It's tough going. It's really incredibly detailed and researched, and it's written for an academic audience. But my grandfather and my father, both in dialogue, are a lot more approachable and a lot more easy to follow and understand. And listening to this 25, 30-minute response about formal cause, what it is and what it isn't, is really a much more approachable introduction. To put it very simply, formal cause is environmental cause, or it's another way of saying the medium is the message, where another word for medium is environment, right? Because the whole point of the medium is the message, while it's a paradox, is to put content aside and look at the structure of the technology and how the structure affects us individually, reorganizing, rewiring our senses, our brains, ourselves, our identities, and then collectively. So when we start reorganizing ourselves and each other, what happens societally with that? And that another word for that is medium. And those are the environmental effects. And that's what formal cause is all about. It's the environment itself as a cause of things, right? Because when you reorganize who you are, you completely change your identity individually and socially. You create a new world around you. And then in response to that new world, you then create new things. New technologies become possible, new cultures, new forms, new things. And the new environment that allows that thing to rise is the formal cause. It's the environment itself as a cause, rather than just, somebody made a design or a blueprint, right? Formal cause is often thought of as a blueprint, the
Mm.
design, but it's more than that. It's the environment, at least in the McLuhan sense of the word. So,
It's
so that was my dad, very serious scholar, BA, MA, PhD, honorary degrees, all that, silently working away in the shop here. And um, I started, for myself, I got interested in the work early on just because, you grow up and you understand that your grandfather's not like other grandfathers. People know who he is, and that's not normal. And so you want to know what's going on with that. But it just went over my head. I tried to read Understanding Media at like 16 and got nowhere. And I tried again in my 20s and got a bit further, not as far as I thought I did. But then in my 30s, my dad needed somebody to travel with him because his health was a little sketchy. And traveling with him, I found that this stuff made sense in a new way for like the first time. And ideas like this, I'm sure probably all of you listening to this can relate that when your intellectual curiosity gets aroused, that's something that's hard to put aside, right? You're
mhm.
probably here because you've become very interested in a subject and are following your passion. Well, this is what happened to me. I found that it made sense for the first time, and because of that, it's like that epiphany is almost a drug, isn't it? It's something very powerful. And so I started getting more involved. And, my relationship with my dad was never like he had with his. I'm not, I, I barely graduated high school. I didn't go to college or university. Like everything I know has basically been hard won just studying with my dad or on my own. I have no interest in academia. And actually, I think that's kind of an advantage for me because media studies has been in academia for decades, and it's
Right.
past time for it to come out into the larger world. And to
Absolutely.
do that, it needs people who can speak like ordinary people, not necessarily full of the jargon and stuff that academics use, because that's just how they talk to each other.
Well, and
I
to be
honestly feel that if I can get this stuff, that anybody can.
right.
So, so what I try and do is I try and take the things that are useful from the work that they did, that we need today to understand our situation. So that's a bit of my background. I started the McLuhan Institute like 5 years ago or so because I saw a time when my dad wouldn't be around anymore and there was nothing in place. When Marshall died, there was nothing really in place to carry on. My dad was just kind of caught there and did what he could on his own, but I didn't want to be left like that. So I thought about something a little more formal, a way to carry this stuff on. And really, within a year, my dad died quite suddenly when we were in Colombia together, which was obviously a shock. But I'd at least already started thinking about how to carry things on. And so, again, what I try to focus on is not so much creating a museum or monuments, but to me, and I'm not talking down about theory, because I know you guys like your theory, but for me, what we need in the world are practical things, tools that we can use. And a book like Understanding Media is the reason why it endures is because even though it uses the media of its time and previous times to make a case, the methods are timeless and they're as applicable today as they were then. And it's really wild because I teach this book in depth. I have an ongoing class, and it's been amazing going through it as AI has been coming into its own and reading alongside of the events that are happening with GPT and Midjourney and all these things. And it's really driving home the fact that he might be talking about the telegraph, but that's just the surface level of things. The methods that he's using to interrogate what's happening um, come up just perfectly if we're talking about AI. So I craft assignments for my students with those principles involved, and it's a really remarkable thing. So yeah, I do
That's
some
awesome.
teaching. I do a bunch of writing. You mentioned the newsletter. I
Right.
started this newsletter. I'm just always trying to reach people where they are. I mean, which is what Marshall did as well, and he got a lot of heat from it from fellow academics who it it's hard to understand it now because it seems every academic wants to be a public intellectual, but that was unseemly in the
Mm-hmm.
50s and 60s. That was not something academics, they still are, but they were even more siloed back then. You know,
Right.
stay in your lane. Don't
Mm-hmm.
Interdisciplinary study was not a thing, but all Marshall McLuhan's work, media studies, is necessarily interdisciplinary because it touches on everything. So it has to draw from everything. The core of McLuhan's studies comes from English, just because it was the techniques Marshall learned in literary criticism that he turned essentially onto culture and technology, that led him to what he ended up doing. But but yeah, what he did was he was very much a rebel in his time, going onto popular media, magazines, newspapers, and then onto television and all the rest of it. It was not really something that was done, but he knew that to his mission, and he had a mission, was to wake people up to what's happening with technologies, and more to the point that we have a lot more agency than we assume we do, which is kind of where our Maelstrom escape strategies comes in.
That's a perfect sort of transition point here. I'm gonna actually start the cloud recording, um,
Recording in progress.
which I should have done a long time ago, but it's just because there's a little bit of a lag on my side, and I want a version of this where when you're talking, the sync is on. I mean, the people who listen, I mean, this is a little bit more like a podcast than a YouTube channel. People tend to listen to this while they're working. That's the kind of the theme of everything going on here. But yeah, it should be fine. But I do want that backup. But this point about McLuhan not being, or Marshall not being a standard academic and getting a lot of heat for it, I kind of wanted to touch on that a little bit more, just to say that obviously we're all into theory, but at the same time outsiders of academia, and so there is like a contradiction and a tension between that kind of writing that is so insular and not concerned with speaking to a public, and then at the same time realizing that there are innovations and very important things developed there, and trying to have like a be sympathetic to the fact that every niche, you know, research conversation or field has its own jargon, its own vernacular. Being sympathetic, but at the same time trying not to fall into it too much ourselves. And McLuhan, I mean, Marshall really is. It's so weird with you being here because I'm like, you're McLuhan,
You can,
but
whatever. Say McLuhan. It does, yeah, it's fine.
well, I wouldn't normally call him Marshall like I know him on a first name basis, but Marshall broke the mold in a sense in a really powerful way that I take great inspiration from. But it's still something he gets shit for. You look on Goodreads reviews for Understanding Media, they're very mixed, and
Yeah.
all of the complaints are basically people who are upset that he's not uh, a very sort of focused researcher who just kind of stays in one little area. Like what they're complaining, saying, "Oh, he uses too many metaphors and he's all over the place and he makes outrageous claims that he doesn't back up." And it's like he's a theorist, and he's dealing with a new field, an emerging field that nobody else is talking about. And yeah, he's got to go all over the place. And but it's kind of like they're critiquing him for not going to the bottom of the iceberg every time he points at something, right?
Yeah. And more than that, their critique is baseless because, and this was one of the early criticisms, and it's still, people still bring it up, is that that's not how you write a textbook. And no, it's not, because it's not a textbook. There's absolutely nothing about that book that pretends to be a textbook.
Mm-hmm.
It's not written for an academic audience at all. It's not written for the classroom. It's written for the world. And if you can let go of that for a minute, you might get somewhere with it. In fact, what I encourage everybody to do is to approach it not like a textbook or even a nonfiction book, but it's a collection of poems. It's a book of poetry. And if you approach it like that, you'll go very far with it. Because think about it. You don't sit down and try to read a book of poetry cover to cover. That's insane. You read a poem at a time. Sometimes you read a piece of a poem at a time. And you read it more than once too, if you're serious about, studying the poem. You look at what the parts inside it are doing. You look at the structure, you look at the rhyme, you look at the rhythm, you consider the intent, you consider the meaning, but you consider all these things. It's not just a vehicle for getting a concept or a theory out in deep detail. It's an exploration. It's a poem, right? In fact, I have my book here, obviously. I look at it even more than just like a book of poems. Like each chapter is a book of poems. It's in my class, in my course, I go through the book from cover to cover, a chapter a week, 3 hours a class, and we go through it word by word. Sometimes I look at the allusions and references. If I can, I pick up the book and look at the context. If he mentions a piece of a poem, I get the poem and we look at the poem. We look at all the people he mentions. What do they have in common? Why did he choose them? Why not others? We look at everything, and it's kind of absurd, but we go really, really deep in it. And even then, it's sometimes too much. I want to take it a page at a time, because there's so much there. It's like, let's read this page, and instead of moving on, we'll see you next week. But we'd be at it for a decade if we did that, right?
Right.
But that's kind of what you have to do. In fact, I don't know if I've told you this, but I'm going to do another version of the course called, instead of Understanding Media Intensive, Understanding Media Condensed. Because I've had quite a few people who'd love to take the course, but they don't have the 3 hours a week to do it. And even I could go 6 hours on a lot of, like, you could go really, really deep. But what I want to do, um, just under the idea that a little bit of the book can go a long way, what I'm proposing to do with this course is take the first 7 chapters, and do plus the introduction and do 8 classes, 8 weeks, of 30 minutes a class. And so each week we'll do like a 10-15 minute summary of the chapter, followed by a closer look at 2 or 3 key phrases. And that's it. Because even from there, you get a lot to think about. It's like I said, a little poetry is a lot of poetry, right? Like it's crazy to try and read an entire book of poetry in one sitting.
This is I know we started this out saying we can't go for 3 hours. It's Mother's Day. We've got to go do but 3 hours really is kind of the obsessive industry standard.
Oh, is it?
Well, I'm making that up, but yes. I mean, for instance, in the podcasting world, Joe Rogan he's obviously the biggest by far, and his has been the 3 hour conversation. That's been the standard. So it is an industry standard in that sense. Obviously, he's got people he can pay to clip it and put little clips of it out, which is a big part of what his success is. But no, people want real conversations nowadays, and if it's not to feel rushed, usually a 3 hour window, especially for a class like with this For They Don't Know What They Do class we've been doing with Michael Downs on Slavoj Žižek's work, those are 3 hours to 4.5 hours every 2 weeks. And when I say an obsessive standard, I'm using obsessive in this sort of Lacanian way, but I don't have to get technical. It stands on its own. Obviously, you have to be pretty obsessive about a topic to want to talk about it for that long, or to not fall off. But then there are people who are interested. Now, they're not obsessing over it, but they're interested. And bridging obsessives with the curious is one of the most difficult responsibilities of anyone doing public philosophy. And I might have mentioned this when we had our private conversation recently, but I really take a lot of inspiration from the fact that Aristotle would he would do like deep, intensive, all morning sessions, and then he would go give his public lecture on everything that was just covered. And the public lecture would be short and less in depth, but it gives people a road in. And so I wanted to do
what I try to do with my McLuhan work. I operate mainly across Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, right? And it's one of McLuhan's main forms was this thing called the probe, or the aphoristic style, just short little statements meant to interrogate, meant to provoke thought, meant to explore, that sort of thing. And it's really in line with what I try to do, which is, I'm all about accessibility in two meanings of the word. One, just putting things out there that people can access, but there's no point in putting things out there if people can't relate to it. I think relatability is another kind of accessibility. And when things get too academic and too theoretical, they get inaccessible. And what's the point of that? You're just speaking to the converted, right? And if you're looking for tenure or book deals or whatever, that makes sense. But if you're actually looking to educate and to change the world, it doesn't make very much sense.
That's right. Well, one caveat though, and that is that people who are making that transition from getting interested to really wanting to dive in the deep end and kind of just be absorbed in the material for a while, that place is lacking a lot of the time, and there's not a place where you can get a good serious crash course lecture style and everything. And so Theory Underground tries to be that bridge by doing small courses, easy to access courses, but also we say reading still matters. And kind of in line with that, we have a quote here from that wonderful interview he did with Playboy.
Okay.
And I can share it on the stream side. I dropped it in the chat, and I'm wondering if either of you would like to read that. This is maybe a way of setting up. It kind of recapitulates a little bit of what you've already said, but I think it brings it back together for a more focused conversation on Maelstrom strategies.
Well, one of you go ahead. I read it all the time.
Yeah,
Okay, Anne will do it.
I can tune in here and go ahead and read it. So all media, from the phonetic alphabet to the computer, are extensions of man that cause deep and lasting changes in him and transform his environment. Such an extension is an intensification, an amplification of an organ, sense, or function, and whether it takes place, the central nervous system appears to institute a self-protective numbing of the affected area, insulating and anesthetizing it from conscious awareness of what's happening to it. It's a process rather like that which occurs to the body under shock or stress conditions, or to the mind in line with the Freudian concept of repression. I call this peculiar form of self-hypnosis narcissus narcosis, a syndrome whereby man remains as unaware of the psychic and social effects of his new technology as a fish of the water it swims in. As a result, precisely at the point where a new media-induced environment becomes all-pervasive and transmogrifies our sensory balance, it also becomes invisible.
That's perfect. And then the following couple of quotes that are up on the screen that people can see, you can always pause this and read them on your own in the future, because we're not going to read both of these quotes. But I do like, whenever we talk about an author, to always at least read one quote, because something about the author's voice or sort of spirit always carries through in a quote. And we think there's been a genocide of voice in the world of summarizing, right? And so we wanted that to come through. And the other thing in these other two quotes is where he starts to talk about this. We are not creatures who evolved to deal with things moving at the speed of light, which is kind of cooked into the idea of digital media. So we live in this world of things moving at the speed of light. This opens up opportunities, but at the same time, it's jarring, and it can really mess with our central nervous system. And he talks about becoming slaves. He says, he says, this upheaval generates great pain and identity loss, which can be ameliorated only through a conscious awareness of its dynamics. If we understand the revolutionary transformations caused by new media, we can anticipate and control them. But if we continue in our self-induced subliminal trance, we will be their slaves. And so I think that's just a nice little bridge here to talking a little bit more about Maelstrom strategies. Could you talk a little bit about what a maelstrom means in this metaphor? Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's a key thing where in his later work he talks about how we could anticipate and control. And what got me onto the Maelstrom escape strategies was the disconnect, or the just the fact that he didn't always think that we could, right? In The Medium is the Massage in 1967, he said, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what is happening, right? Which one of the things he mentioned as questions was about this idea of technological determinism. And only somebody who hasn't read any Marshall McLuhan could call him a technological determinist, because he's saying that we have all the agency. There is no inevitability if we're willing to contemplate the situation, if we're willing to study the media, what they actually are, what we do when we create new technologies, and what it does to us. All the things he mentions in that quote about narcosis, how when we extend a sense or a function, we also seem to amputate it. And what's that all about? But the thing that got me onto escape strategies was I found this really rare off-print called A Historical Approach to the Media. It's just a short thing he published in the Teachers College Record, November 1955. And it was this paragraph here. Improvements in the means of communication are usually based on a shift from one sense to another, and this involves a rapid refocusing of all previous experience. That's kind of McLuhan, very basic McLuhan stuff, that each technology affects our senses and reorganizes them. So there's a shift that happens. And when that happens, we reorganize everything about ourselves, our preferences, our likes, our aesthetics, the things that make us uncomfortable, all those things shift. And you can use, it is therefore a simple maxim of communication study that any change in the means of communication will produce a chain of revolutionary consequences at every level of culture and politics. But here's the kicker. He says, and because of the complexity of the components in this process, prediction and control are not possible. And I read that and I was like, what? Because it totally goes against everything that he says later on. And it was like, well, what happened? You know, Marshall, what led you to change your mind that prediction and control were possible? Because he definitely goes there. He says it over and over and over and over about there's no inevitability, you know, in order to gain orderly control. This whole idea of media ecology is predicated on the idea that though the components in this process might be very, very complex, we do have control. And the thing is, the way I put it is that human ingenuity gets us into these dilemmas, and human ingenuity can get us out of them. You know, it's amazing what we can do when we have to, when we're forced to, right? And up until now, and including now, there's been nothing to force us to do things any differently than we have been doing. There's no political will because there's no popular will, probably because people think that the components in this process are too complex to predict and control. But Marshall discovered otherwise in his work, and he spent the rest of his life and career trying to explain to people and wake people up to the notion that we can do something about it. Maelstrom escape strategies.
But we have to. That's why he's so concerned with waking people up, is because if not woken up, we become slaves to these environments, right?
Right. And his point was that when change happened gradually and very slowly, it wasn't such a big deal. But today, when we move literally at the speed of light, annihilation becomes possible from moment to moment. You know, he brought up Bertrand Russell a lot, who said, if we only raise the temperature of the bathwater by 0.5 degrees an hour, we wouldn't know when to scream, right? And it's this notion that if you get into a lukewarm bath and slowly add hot water, you can get the temperature up really, really, really high, and you'll be sweating in there and stuff. But if you were to take that temperature you've built up to and try to step into it from room temperature, you wouldn't get your toe in it. You know, you pull out, ouch, that's way too hot, right? So it's a bit of a mixed blessing about the age that we're in, that technology, our technological state is that of the really, really hot bath, right? And because of that, we have the opportunity to recognize things about it, that when change happens so gradually, it was impossible to perceive, you know? So, but the problem is that we don't really realize it. And so we're burning ourselves constantly, you know? And the difficulty is that, you know, innovation moves at the speed of light and regulation moves at the speed of paper. And it's really the most succinct way I can put it. Our problem
that's really good.
Is that how do you regulate when technology you can't keep up with technology. It's a dilemma. I think it's solvable, but it's very difficult. Did you want to say something, Dave?
Well, I
Yeah,
guess
I was
if I could come in
And
really quick, because I guess the question
exactly.
I want to know, and we've been using this word maelstrom, and so I'm
right.
curious, what, first of all, like what is a maelstrom? Why choose the word maelstrom when talking about this? And then what is the maelstrom that you see today? And maybe what was the maelstrom that Marshall was writing about and talking about back in the 60s? Because obviously, as you're talking about this technology is growing at the speed of light and the regulation not so much. And so very big difference between technology of the 60s and the 70s versus right now, with all of us have little computers in our pockets and TikTok and Instagram and the news media. So maybe tell us a little bit about this word maelstrom and all of its different forms.
Sure. I'm not sure it really is all that different, except on the very most surface of levels. The technologies from then to now. Maelstrom, part of it goes back to Marshall used the word maelstrom, but he was very fond of a painter and author, Wyndham Lewis. Wyndham Lewis is a bit of a controversial figure. He wrote some early stuff kind of in praise of Hitler, which he very soon regretted and tried to remedy, but it hung over him, I think, for a lot of his career. Brilliant painter. I can't pretend to understand his writing. It's wild. He wrote this trilogy called the Childermas trilogy, the Human Age trilogy, which is just crazy. But Marshall really, really admired his work. And he's one of the founders of what was called the Vorticist school. So vortex, maelstrom related, out of England. Have a look at his work. He's one of my favorite painters. His drawings are incredible. But it actually goes beyond the 60s. And this was Marshall's first published book, The Mechanical Bride, Folklore of Industrial Man. And this idea of the maelstrom comes through his work very early. This is one of the early examples. I'll read this. It's a bit of a read, but we should hear it. And it says,
Absolutely.
this is kind of media literacy stuff more than media ecology, because media literacy is very concerned with the people behind technologies or media outlets or whatever, and their agendas and their biases, and understanding propaganda and things like that, which is important, but it's also content level stuff. If you take away content, there's not too much that media literacy has to say, which is interesting to think about. And so this book is all about actually looking at advertising, and it seems banal now, but in 1951, when this was published, and when in the decade leading up to it that Marshall was teaching it in universities, you didn't look at advertising critically. People didn't. It just wasn't a thing. But Marshall was one of the first to treat ads like literature and apply tools of literary criticism to advertising. So he says, ours is the first age in which many thousands of the best trained individual minds have made it a full-time business to get inside the collective public mind. To get inside in order to manipulate, exploit, control is the object now, and to generate heat, not light, is the intention. To keep everybody in the helpless state engendered by prolonged metal rutting is the effect of many ads and much entertainment alike. Since so many minds are engaged in bringing about this condition of public helplessness, and since these programs of commercial education are so much more expensive and influential than the relatively puny offerings sponsored by schools and colleges, it seemed fitting to devise a method for reversing the process. Why not use the new commercial education, or advertising, as a means to enlighten its intended prey? Why not assist the public to observe consciously the drama which is intended to operate upon it unconsciously? As this method was followed, a descent into the Maelstrom by Edgar Poe kept coming to mind. Poe's sailor saved himself by studying the action of the whirlpool and by cooperating with it. The present book likewise makes few attempts to attack this very considerable current and pressures set up around us today by the mechanical agencies of the press, radio, movies, and advertising. It does attempt to set the reader at the center of this revolving picture created by these affairs, where he may observe the action that is in progress and in which everybody is involved. From the analysis of this action, it is hoped many individual strategies may suggest themselves. So he says, Poe's sailor says that when locked in by the whirling walls of the numerous objects which floated in that environment, quote, I must have been delirious. This is Poe's narrator speaking. For I even sought amusement in speculating upon the relative velocities and their several descent toward the foam below. I'll stop there, but in very brief, this short story by Edgar Allan Poe, A Descent into the Maelstrom, what happens in that is that there's a sailor and his brother, and they're fishermen, and this is in the North Atlantic. And where they all fish, everybody in the community, there's this giant whirlpool, this vortex, this maelstrom in the ocean. And everybody knows it's there. It's no surprise. You stay away from it and you're okay. But the thing is like the best fishing grounds are on the other side of it. And there was a 2 times a day when the tide is at its lowest, that if you know what you're doing, you can kind of get around it and get to those fishing grounds where you can do like a week's worth of fishing in an afternoon, but it's dangerous. So what happens is the narrator and his brothers have been doing this and risking their lives basically over, monetary gain. And one time coming back, they just messed up and they got sucked into the vortex. And his brother loses his mind and like jumps overboard. And the thing about it is it's this giant maelstrom in the ocean. And so they're sucked in and they're going around and around and around. And the narrator, the sailor, talks about how this is just the kind of guy he was, that once the original terror wore off, he started to look around him because it's taking forever to get sucked down to the bottom of this thing, right? And he starts noticing things about it. And the curious fact that certain objects, instead of descending into the vortex, are actually going up and out of it. I was like, well, that's interesting. And he studies them more, and thinks that he finds, the key to why some things are going up and other things aren't. And so he straps himself to this chest and he times it just right. And just before his boat goes over to the final drop, he jumps overboard and is sucked up and out of the vortex and washed up on the beach and lived to tell the tale. Of course, nobody believes him or anything, but Marshall used this story as a very obvious metaphor for where we are at technologically. So we're in this technological vortex. It's all around us. The difference being we can feel it, but we can't see it, right? Because of the invisible nature of the environment. Environments tend to be invisible, right? We don't notice things. A lot of things are beneath our notice. And to the quote that you put up, a lot of that seems to be self-induced or willful ignorance, or maybe some kind of coping strategy. Just the way we use anesthetic during an operation, or the way a doctor has to be detached. Because if you were that involved, you wouldn't be able to do what you needed to do. There's some kind of things like that at play, and maybe those kind of motives or reasonings aren't the most important thing about it, but just the fact that it's difficult to perceive our environment, like he says, as the fish is unaware of the water that they swim in. It's generally when things break down that we notice them, like when the fish is pulled out of the water, all of a sudden you realize, oh, wait, something's gone wrong, right? Anyway, I was really interested in this tension between how Marshall early in his career felt that, well, this technology thing is like way too complex to ever hope to control, to just a couple years later, completely reversing that decision. And I've also been fascinated by his use over 30 years of this Edgar Allan Poe story, which he uses over and over again in his writing and his speeches as a way to give us hope that by looking around and studying our environment, we might hope to escape. But he never follows through and tells us what to do, in such explicit terms. And so that's kind of the challenge that I set for myself. And that's what Maelstrom Escape Strategies is about. And it's kind of two things. The difficult thing is, what can one person do? What can you do? You're not creating the next iPhone. You don't make those kind of shots. You don't make those kind of decisions. We're not politicians that can do anything about it, right? We're just people out here. We need to have these things because the world has them, and if we're going to get along, we got to have them, right? Like, it's a very privileged person who can not have a smartphone. So my focus is on strategies, on ways that we can improve our situation on a daily level that anybody can do. Because the obvious solution is just to throw away your smartphone, if the smartphone is the cause of your stress. But we got to make a living, and we got to do what we got to do. Most people can't just throw away their smartphone, but we can make changes. And it's a tricky thing because their technologies affect us on so many levels. And there are things we can do something about, and things that are more difficult to change. One of the suggestions I make in the book is that, a lot of the trouble that people have today due to the rate of change is heavy anxiety and uncertainty and all these things, because we're just moving at this crazy pace, right? How do we slow down? And it's interesting, but we have a lot more control than we assume. One of the things I suggest people do is to read as much on page rather than on screen as you can. And this isn't because I'm trying to be precious about print or something, or books, although I love books, obviously. But because mechanically, structurally, to read from a page versus to read from a screen is a very different experience. It's cognitively different in the moment, and it has different effects. When you read on the screen, or an e-reader, or anything else like that, a screen-based reading, your eye and the process of reading is different. You tend to read faster, you tend to skim and to skip and to kind of summarize and look for key things. Versus when you read from a page, your eye tends to travel more slowly. So that's one way to do it. Another way, and this is funny because I was inspired by a trip we took last summer, and we're driving through the mountains. And when you come to go down a mountain, there's, warning signs, and it says, it has an image of a mountain like this and a truck going down. It says trucks use lower gear, right? So what a trucker will do is they'll go into lower gears that force the engine to slow down and force the truck to go at a slower pace. And we can do this with our minds, which is incredible. But the way I put it is this: I can type about 80 words a minute accurately, and I can write around 40. And I've clocked them both, and I'd invite you to check it out. You'll find it probably holds about the same. Maybe you're a better typer than I am. Maybe I'm a faster writer, but it's a very big difference in speed. Okay. And just like the truck, if you want to write a page by hand, it slows down your mind, because your mind has to keep pace with your hand in order to get a connected sentence across, much less a page, right? Like, your mind has to slow down. So you're actually, I guess it's a kind of wellness. You're forcing your mind and your body and your senses to to ratchet things down a little bit. And really, and I've had people do this and report back to me, if you can do this for 15 minutes a day, literally 15 minutes a day, write a single page, right, by hand every day. And look, we've all got crazy busy lives. There are single parents out there, you know, who are working 2 jobs. But you know what? Everybody can find 15 minutes in a day to do this. After the kids are in bed, I know you're exhausted, but take 15 minutes and write something. Write what you see around you in the room. Write a letter to a relative. Write a letter to yourself. Write a letter to your children for 10 years from now, whatever. But if you do this every day, over a period of weeks, you'll notice a change. 100 guaranteed, you'll notice a change. So while we can't necessarily all throw our smartphones out, we can find these little things to do to slow ourselves down, to make little changes in our lives that add up to big changes. And if we sit around here and wait for any level of government to regulate technology, we'll be getting old, you know?
Yeah. And so I guess like a question that I have to interject here,
Sure.
because I'm a lot younger than maybe some of the other people in this class or in this field. Like I'm Gen Z, was born in 1999. And so I grew up, like I went through puberty and I had an iPad, I had Instagram, right? And so my whole life has just been this struggle of like trying to try something new. And then the addictiveness of these technologies like sucks me back in. I mean, last year I purchased a Nokia like flip phone. It's a terrible phone. And so on the one hand, that was just it was just a bad phone. And now that we're living in Mexico, I had to like reuse my iPhone to like be able to use maps and translator and stuff. So on the one hand, there was that issue of like the addiction kind of pulled me back in to be using my iPhone again. But then on the other hand, like everyone else is using an iPhone. Everyone is in a kind of a texting age. And so I also find difficulty trying to live outside of the iPhone or the quickness of everything when everyone else is on it. And so I guess like, would you kind of offer the same wisdom or any other like strategies for maybe a younger generation or to kind of combat that like addictiveness? Because I think scientists at this point have shown, they developed some of these apps to be as addictive as like gambling.
Yeah. And it's certainly morally questionable. And it's hard because so much, it's no reason why we're post-literate, because the barrier to entry for usability between this object and this object, who's going to win? You can give a smartphone to a kid in a carriage, a year old, and they'll figure it out within seconds and be doing stuff with it, right? You give a book to a kid in a carriage and they're chewing on it, right? Literacy, being able to read and write and make sense and communicate using a book takes years, right? But what happens during that process is it's forming your senses in your mind in a certain way. And it leads to a certain kind of society. And when we leave that behind, we leave all those things behind. And it makes it very, very difficult for somebody in younger generations to acquire the habits of literacy, right? People don't read because it's hard. They don't have their body, you're not built for it, right? You haven't been conditioned with literacy. And it's a conditioning. Just as any other kind, it happens in the early years of our life, or happened for me anyway. And it's a lot more difficult to do later in life. But this is the great thing about the human brain, is it's very, very plastic and malleable. And yes, it would be better. You know, it's like learning a new language. If you can teach a kid under 6 a dozen languages a lot more easily than you can pick up a second language at age 20, right? But you can still pick up that language, and you can still learn how to read. Because look, literacy is more than just being able to read text on a screen or on a page. It's a habit, and it's a lot more, and it's very difficult. And it takes work, right? So again, 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes. And it doesn't matter if you read Dostoevsky or Marx or McLuhan or Dr. Seuss, right? It's because the medium is the message. Content matters, obviously. There's beautiful things and ugly things for that matter. But it's the structure and what that does to you and what that allows affords you, that is the important thing. So, read 10, 15 minutes a day, find some poetry, find a book, a magazine, whatever, but keep at it and you'll find it gets easier. I'm not speaking to you specifically, Anne, but
Oh,
in
no, for
general,
sure. Yeah.
younger generations who find it difficult to read. It is very worth the effort, because again,
Yeah.
it spreads out into your life. It's not just about being able to read something off a page. It's the habit and the effect of that in your life that is what makes a difference.
Yeah, you have to have a little bit of discipline to fight it, to combat it. And that's, I think, something that you had mentioned earlier on in this interview is like wanting to make this more practical, and the practical application is as important as the theory. And so that's what Dave and I have been trying to develop in this critical media theory and digital literacy course, is combining the theory and the why, and understanding our values and understanding our relationship with the technology and what it's doing, and then taking some books that exist that have done a little bit more like social science research, who are a little bit more practical and offer some advice. Like, for example, Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport will be one that we will be exploring. And so with that, I wanted to kind of ask you, I had read not too long ago an article that you put on Medium called Macro Media Literacy, and you mentioned like digital literacy and media literacy throughout this conversation, and how it's not quite sufficient in just the being able to use it. And so I guess I'm curious, what is your definition of digital literacy? Why does the current definition maybe not suffice for you? And how does that fit in with your Maelstrom escape strategies?
Sure. The definition of it suffices it for what it is, right? Media literacy, digital media literacy, media and information literacy, critical media literacy, all these things amount to, like I said, it's important. It's really good to know, and it's important to know that the people behind a lot of content and a lot of technology have political or commercial agendas that they're trying to get through to you. It's very good to know that. But what McLuhan work is interested in is everything else that happens along the way. The next post I'm doing for my newsletter, which I meant to do this week, but life, was about a passage in Understanding Media in the first chapter titled "The Medium is the Message," where Marshall paraphrases T.S. Eliot, who was talking about poetry. T.S. Eliot says the chief use of meaning in a poem is to satisfy one habit of the reader. It's like the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. And Marshall paraphrases this in Understanding Media by saying that content is the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. And I thought about this for a long time, because to distract the watchdog of the mind from what? For what aims, right? Because it sounds kind of insidious, but this goes beyond political or commercial aims. And his point being that whether we're reading Dostoevsky or a Playboy interview, while we're reading, this interface, this technology is rewiring ourselves. It's rearranging our senses. It's putting us into a certain structure related to the structure of the technology itself. And different people with different sensory makeups are different people. We have different identities, we have different values, different preferences. And so, and this happens very much beneath our notice while we're occupied with whatever's on TikTok or Instagram or YouTube or whatever else. That's what we pay attention to, and everything else is happening on the other side. So content is this juicy piece of meat distracting us from the actual effect of the technology. It's like I think about, you see an ad for a drug, a pharmaceutical drug, and it's got like these people walking hand in hand down the beach, and it's a perfect day, and the surf and the seagulls overhead. And you're captivated by this, while in the background, this guy is saying, if you take this drug, you're going to start bleeding out of your butt and your guts are going to fall out and all this other stuff, right? The side effects, possible side effects. What we've learned is that the side effects, like if you want to look at a balance, the intended effects get very quickly outweighed by the side effects, or what we call the unintended consequences, right? Which always end up being much, much more of a problem, or, heavier on the scale than the intended consequences, right? Or the thing that we're using it for. It's like, oh, great. Now we can have a computer in our pocket, and I can call somebody on the go, and I can Google something, and I can find my way around with the map. Awesome. Also, I'm socially maladjusted, and I have anxiety, and I don't know who I am anymore, and all the rest of it, right? These are side effects that we don't pay attention to, or we have a very hard time attributing to their source. And there are also complicated reasons for that. But I kind of got lost from where the question started to where we ended up.
No, that was actually really good. And I think you successfully not only addressed it, but kind of tied. Oh, Anne, can you mute? I'm hearing myself back. Okay. I think you've successfully you've not just tied up that question, but you kind of brought it all back together again. And we're at the 1 hour point here, and so what we were going to do after the 1 hour point is open it up to Q&A for the people who have signed up early for the course. There are a few of them in the chat right now, and so while they figure out if they're going to ask any questions or anything like that on the live side, I'll just say two things. One is that we'll spend about 15 minutes having a live Q&A conversation here. Folks in the chat are welcome to pitch in as well, but the people who are in the course are obviously going to get a little priority there. But then also some people in the class might not want to appear with their voice or their face on a live stream, and so we'll do another 15 minutes on the backside once we've closed out the live stream. And so for these next 15 minutes, Nance, Philip, Ayo, if you're here, go ahead and turn your cameras on. You'll be able to introduce yourselves in a second. Quick heads up to everybody, though. As Anne had kind of alluded to, we are teaching a course called Digital Literacy and Critical Media Theory, or CMT. And this course was supposed to begin today, but we're actually pushing it off 1 month and kind of calling this event a pre-course event because we didn't get a lot of signups. And so we're actually kind of changing our entire approach. We're not really planning on a whole lot more signups right now. The one that when we do this with the intention of a lot more signups, that's going to be a sort of course that begins with New Year's. People who sign up now are going to basically be a part of a small research cohort. We've kind of changed the approach a little bit, and the research cohort is developing stuff towards the actual course that will begin in January of next year as a sort of New Year's resolution for a lot of people. That's going to be a 6-month course where people meet twice per month, once for a lecture and discussion, and the other time that they meet in that month is more of like a cell phone addiction recovery group where people will talk about the journaling that they're doing, and they will talk about some Maelstrom strategies that they might have applied in their life that month, and or some of the things that Anne will be bringing to the table. And so if that course sounds interesting to you, start thinking about it. It's coming up really quickly here next year. But also, if you're interested in being a part of the research cohort, the people who are a part of that cohort are going to have an opportunity to get published in a special volume dedicated to the topic. And so the people who are currently signed up for this course are all really good writers. And so there's kind of like a level of research and writing here that will rub off on you if you're part of the writing workshops that kind of follow from that. And so that's my little plug for the course. There will be a PSA that I roll at the end of this video with more information so that you can sign up. But just be advised that it says that this course starts today, when technically it really begins on the second Sunday of June. And so with all of that said, let's take some questions. Nance, Philip?
I'll just add one more thing.
Please.
You, Anne, had mentioned this piece I wrote, Macro Media Literacy. That led to a book which is coming out in the next month or two through Bruckner Verlag out of Germany, called Beyond Media Literacy, which is a collection of essays kind of taking as a premise, that media literacy is not enough. Or even media ecology, as it's kind of being called, doesn't seem to be enough either. So how can we go beyond these things, and how can we make progress, and what does that look like? And that's kind of related to what you're talking about there, which I think is fantastic, and good luck to it.
Yeah, I think I just really appreciate that the work that you're doing and the perspective that you bring being outside of academia, because the impact of this technology is so real. We all feel it in our everyday lives. I think especially the younger generation, like I said, who kind of grew up with this. We know it feels icky. We know that there's more to life outside of the technology. And so the development of these strategies that you're contributing to in this discourse it's really helpful. It's really inspiring. As someone who's been trying my whole life to develop these strategies, I'm really glad I've been able to discover your work through Dave, and that we get to kind of explore your work and Marshall's work and some other contributions to this. So just thank you for being here and for the work that you do and that you've continued from your grandfather and your father.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm happy to answer some questions if anybody has some questions or comments or whatnot.
Nance, Philip, Ayo, I want to prioritize you guys because I do have a backlog of questions, but I really want to get to you guys.
Hey, how are you? Nice to meet you.
Hey.
I think one thing that kind of always sticks out to me is when people have these conversations publicly, it always seems like there's almost a weird version of conservatism where people think there's a natural state that we can return to.
Yeah.
And I know that's not where you're coming from. But it almost feels like I want to use that as an excuse to just be a nihilist and just say, well, screw it. And you're very positive about everything. And I guess that's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, you know what? What's the alternative? Nihilism's no fun. It's not. It gets old. It gets real old. And I have kids, and I'm a poet, okay? Which means that I'm in love with the world, I think. I'm in love with beauty and the world around us and the exquisite moments of joy that surround us at any given moment. It's not to say there isn't absolute hell around us at any given moment, but we're here for a short amount of time. And myself, I'd rather spend my time appreciating and perpetuating love and joy and all the rest of it. And I am very hopeful, just like I think Marshall was, when he kept saying things like there is no inevitability as long as there is a willingness to contemplate what's happening. The funny thing, the ironic thing, and the paradoxical thing about Marshall being this rebel, extra academic, whatever, is that he was an extremely conservative person. He was a lifetime Catholic, a very conservative, a convert to Catholicism. And when asked about it, when asked if there was any time when Marshall would rather live, he'd say, I'd rather live any time that we're willing to leave things the hell alone for a minute. He just wanted to be left alone, and not be in the midst of this vortex of change, which is interesting. You brought up an interesting point. People always want, and I find this because I live in an area that's kind of a tourist area, and a lot of people have discovered it from Toronto and stuff. And I myself am originally from Toronto, people always want things to stay the same from when they moved here. And it's like, oh, these newcomers are coming in and changing up everything. It's like, well, you kind of did the same thing. And, I hate to break it to you, but 250 years ago, people came in here and, the original inhabitants here had a pretty good thing going that we kind of messed up in a big way. I think it's kind of human nature to want things the way we best enjoy them, right? And this is what nostalgia is. Nostalgia is simply a reaction to the fact that the world has moved on, usually technologically, and we're no longer anchored in the time where we were formed and feel most comfortable, right? I'm very much a fatalist, but I'm also an optimist because, like I said, I really believe in human ingenuity, and when we're pushed to find solutions, we find them. When we're given constraints, we work with them. Nobody has given us good enough technological restraints. People are still developing, I'm getting on my soapbox here, but we're still optimizing technologies to capture people's attention. Eyeballs on screens. And it's awful, really. I mean, it's amazing that companies are still getting away with this shit because there's no measure of where this is good for us as people. It's crazy. The only thing I can hope is that we're going to get fed up enough about it to demand change. And this is the mixed blessing about where we are, is like everybody knows that things are seriously wrong, right? I was invited to give a speech to the law faculty at the University of Windsor about technology and regulation, which was a great opportunity. And I wrote a piece called From Snake Oil to Silicon, a modest case for something or other. I was kind of playing on Swift and his modest proposal because it's almost absurd to suggest it. But I looked at historically the creation of the FDA in the United States in the early 20th century. There was a time when the food and the drug industries were unregulated. It was the Wild West. They could do what they want. What happened was people were getting sick from tainted meat and stuff, and they demanded politicians regulate the industries. And that led to the creation of the FDA and the Food and Drug Safety Act, which said that drugs or foods had to be safe and effective. So they had to not kill you or make you sick, and they had to do what they said they were going to do, right? This led to the current situation where if Pfizer or whatever, COVID vaccines aside, wants to put a new drug in the market, they have to go through rigorous testing, various levels of trials before they even get to human trials, right? But this wasn't always the case. They never used to do any of that stuff. They could make it, put it in the market, free market, right? This is America. And you can imagine that in the early 20th century, you think Bayer or Pfizer were in favor of this? Hell no. They fought it tooth and nail, just like the technology companies are today. How can you stop us from bringing our product to market? These guys are going to get an advantage and blah, blah, blah. Same old arguments. But are Bayer or Pfizer hurting for profits? Are they losing money because they're forced to make sure this stuff doesn't harm us? No, they're not. And it won't harm Apple's bottom line or Microsoft's or anybody's else to take the time to consider what the downstream effects of these are going to be and to do what they can about it. You know, why should we accept the state where us and our kids are being made into, you know, crazy people, forgive the expression or whatever, I don't know how to phrase it, but you know what I mean. Like, why should we just accept this as the way it is when we don't have to? You know, we can do better. And companies aren't going to do it willingly, because what's in it for them to do that? Why would a company possibly not release the technology as soon as they can to hit market before somebody else? No incentive to. The only way it's going to happen is if people like us make enough noise about it and demand change. And look, regulating content isn't going to cut it. You know, making sure that TikTok isn't spying on us isn't going to cut it. That's not where this stuff is happening. It's not happening on that level. It's happening on the deeper technological level. And nobody in government, nobody in these Senate hearings is talking about that, and they need to. Until they do, it's you know, it's a farce, honestly.
This is why we need the sequel to is it Mr. Smith Goes to Washington? We need Mr. McLuhan Goes to Washington, you know,
Hell
to talk about.
Yeah. I'm trying really hard to make that happen. I'm trying to get
Cool.
on Rogan too, even though God, it's a nightmare, but I do it.
Oh, wow.
One second. I wanted to ask a quick question here.
Yeah.
And kind of tying in on the aspect of criminality. I think a lot of people, maybe they don't know so much about how deep it goes, but the attention economy, structuring and hijacking our need for recognition, it's something I was talking about like 8 years ago at academic conferences, and at the time there wasn't this discourse about this the echo chamber silo effect. There wasn't this algorithmic like, oh, people are in algorithmic echo chambers. There was none of that. No one was talking about that. No one was talking about distraction yet. Sherry Turkle had written some good books, and there was a little bit of stuff being done. And so I was talking about this at conferences, and I think it was around the time that a lot of baby boomers, especially professors, were starting to use Facebook and stuff. You know, they were kind of late to that game. And at the point that they're getting on it, they're proud of themselves. It's all positive. They're hip now. And so in those kind of environments, I got a lot of pushback. Whereas I just felt like people who'd been using the technology longer, they already got it. And now I feel like everyone's on board. Like everyone can at least agree that, oh, I'm so distracted now. My attention span has gone down so much. But the criminality aspect is that that's by design, which obviously you kind of touched on this. But for me, a big something I always cite is how in Silicon Valley, the private schools ban this technology that they develop from their children being able to use them in those schools. And that's pretty much one of the only places in the United States where it's actually banned from being used in the school. Mm-hmm. And so I think that this ties into awareness and the importance of awareness, because as people become aware, that's obviously a very important factor. And so I wanted to tie that into something that you had written, and I don't remember exactly how it goes, but basically it's this idea that determinism is the fate of people who are, I don't remember the rest of it. How does this go? And what is this idea?
Shoot, yeah, that's a McLuhan quote. Let me see if I can pull it up on my McLuhan Institute Twitter. It's such a handy thing, searchable function. I put in so many choice McLuhan quotes, and I realized a while back that I can search them by keyword. I was like, oh, that's really handy. So we go to McLuhan Institute and determinism. It's something like determinism is the result of the behavior of those who are determined to ignore what is happening about them. Recognition of the psychic and social effects of technological change makes it possible to neutralize the effects of innovation. That's not from 2023, that's from 1966. 1966, right? And what have we done? But that's recognition of the psychic and social effects of technological change. That's not content, and don't get elsewhere. Marshall talks about the personal and social consequences. Don't get hung up on psychic. He's just talking about the senses and the brain. But the psychic and social effects of technological change, regardless of whether we're reading Time magazine or Playboy or whatever else, it's the medium is the message, is what he's saying, right? And again, coming back to this, and the first thing that I read there is exactly what you're talking about, Dave. Ours is the first age in which many thousands of the best trained individuals have made it a full-time business to get inside the collective public mind. To generate heat, not light, is the intention. To generate heat, not light. In other words, to keep us occupied and not inquisitive, right? It's the exact same thing. And so this is nothing new, and it makes you wonder, it's like, what is wrong with us? That's 1951, right? That's 80 years later, 70 years later, right? And we still are arguing about content. There's a great quote, thinking about banning cell phones in school, right? There's this debate between Marshall McLuhan, W.H. Auden, and Buckminster Fuller, and they're talking about television. It's on YouTube. And it's like half an hour long. And the banger in it is Auden is like, oh, I don't have a television and I wouldn't dream of having one, right? And Marshall says, well, you merely suffer the consequences without enjoying any of the benefits. Okay.
Nice.
And he's making light of it, but think about it for a second. What he's saying is, okay, great, you don't have a television, but you still live in the world of television. Great, you don't have a smartphone, but guess what? We live in a smartphone, and you might be opting out for a couple hours a day or something or whatever. But the fact is that these things restructure us and society. And whether you take part in it or not is kind of, you're giving yourself a little more importance than you deserve. So you're suffering the consequences without enjoying any of the benefits. So, I know very well the thing about this. I got to do what I got to do, I'm trying to raise awareness. And how do you do that? On the internet, right? Like, I live in the country. The course that I teach in understanding media, I've got 20 students from India to England to North and South America, and none that live anywhere near here. If I were to hold this course here, there would be nobody in it. So we have to use the tools that we have available, but and we're in the society that we're in, and we do have some measure of control. Unfortunately, the time to make structural changes is when you're designing the structure. And this is something that technologists, this is why I really try to work with engineers, founders, developers, and stuff to give them an understanding of how these things work. Because, hey, you're the people designing these things that are going to be the next generation of humans. And think about it. Look at the structure you're creating and what's it going to do to us, to our structure, individually, personally, and collectively, socially. Until we start to do that, we're always going to be playing catch up.
I think that's a perfect point to close this thing out. We're going to go to the private side and touch base with the other people in the class. Thank you so much for joining, Andrew.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to talk with you.
And now a quick message from our sponsors. Just kidding. This will be neither quick nor from any corporate or state sponsorship. What follows is a description of Theory Underground, a thank you to its patrons, information about the upcoming tour, and 3 brand new courses that you might want to enroll in. Stay for the whole thing to get promo codes to save on those courses or information about the financial aid scholarship.
Theory Underground is a philosophy lecture course gated social media site and publishing house by and for working class intellectuals and renegade academics. The subject matters dealt with at Theory Underground are the most important, yet neglected for understanding ourselves, the world, and ways of possibly changing it.
Because we have no corporate or state sponsors, only a small band of patrons, everything in this first year of operation helps immensely. Special thank yous to Bert, Nance, Marilyn, Carl, and Adam for your help in the $50 per month patron tier. If you want to help but the $50 tier is too much, consider donating towards meals and gasoline via Venmo or PayPal.
The gasoline is for our countrywide tour of the U.S., where we aim to meet with supporters of this effort and do events to draw in new people who do not necessarily belong to marketing demographics predetermined by the attention economy. We will be giving lectures, leading discussions, and promoting several brand new books. Our goal is to only go to towns and cities where we have personal invitations from at least one person. We are doing this underground style, which for the hardcore punk scene in the US meant coming for long enough to get to know the area and do multiple events, not this modern treadmill of a new city each night in an attempt to maximize fame and profit. If you are interested in being a host, guide, or volunteer, then please fill out the form at https://theory-underground.com/US-tour-2023. In an attempt to utilize the resources made publicly available, we will be using libraries for most of our events. So if you have a local library card and can reserve a space for us, we would most appreciate it. Alternatively, some of you might have access to pretty epic venue spaces. Just let us know ahead of time.
Now for the courses. The 3 upcoming courses are What is Sex?, Digital Literacy and CMT, Critical Media Theory, and Being and Time. All courses at Theory Underground are available after the fact on demand, but some people get a lot more out of doing it live with a cohort.
If you are looking to think deeply about the devices we have become reliant on while experimenting with new ways of reclaiming your attention span and relationship with yourself and others, then check out Digital Literacy and Critical Media Theory, a course that is structured to combat the attention economy while strategically using some of its tools to help us gain a freer relationship to our devices. If interested, an introduction to this course will be shared at the end of this video. Just make sure to click on it. The lectures for this course take place on the second Sunday of every month for 6 months, starting in May. If you sign up at Tier 3, you also get access to the recovery group component, which also meets once per month. Enroll with promo code CMT Early Bird YT before May 13th for 20% off.
If you are frustrated by the discourse revolving around gender ideology, left and right, then join us in thinking deeper about sex. Cadell Last of Philosophy Portal is joining up with Theory Underground to teach Alenka Zupanchik's What is Sex?, one of the most succinct and cutting-edge works of theory dealing with the topic. Zupančik is one of the Slovenian circle's most incisive critics of both naive progressivism and reactionary tendencies when it comes to thinking about the relationship between sex, culture, and subjectivity. If interested, watch 3 Reasons to Read What is Sex, which will be shared on screen at the end of this video. What is Sex begins in May and goes through June, meeting for 4 lecture sessions, and, surprise, you will actually get to meet Alenka Zupančik herself. Use promo code WHATISSEXEARLYBIRDYT before May 7th for 20% off.
And just so you know, everybody, don't stress the capitalization. I just make it that way so it's more readable. It's not case sensitive. Being in Time is one of the most notorious, profound, and difficult works of philosophy from the last 200 years. Its deconstruction of modernity and fundamental challenge to scientism is a prerequisite rite of passage for any thinker who wants to seriously engage with continental philosophy, social theory, or world change. In this course, you will learn about what Heidegger means by being in the world, Dasein, being unto death, and so many other crucial developments. But more important than all these buzzwords is just taking on this work itself and wrestling with the text. Doing so will rapidly accelerate your reading comprehension abilities and simultaneously challenge some of your most deep-seated presuppositions. As before, an introductory video to this course is shared on the end screen of this video, or can be accessed from the links in the description. Being in Time Division 1 starts in June and ends July 22nd. Division 2 begins August 19th and goes through October. To sign up for Division 1 today, use the promo code BEINGINTIME EARLYBIRD YT before the end of May for 20% off.
If you feel obstructed by the cost of these courses, then we have good news. But before getting into the financial aid info, why are there even price tags at all, much less tiered pricing? First, because some people just want to audit, whereas others want constructive critical feedback or even one-on-one sessions. The tiers exist so that you can get the value you are seeking while compensating me, Dave, fairly for the time and energy required.
Second, the prices set for these courses aim to make Theory Underground sustainable, meaning that it will bring in enough to pay for the costs of the operation, including my personal bills, since I want to be a co-earner in the household when my soon-to-be wife and I start a family.
Thirdly, people tend to take the things they pay for more seriously, and we want you to get the most out of this experience.
With those reasons aside, we do not seek to exclude anyone who is struggling just to get by. We have a financial aid scholarship option for people who are currently between jobs or who live in a country on a cheap currency, like many of you who watch from Thailand, India, Mexico, or Poland. To name a few of the residents of some of the people who have already received financial aid scholarships in the last couple of months. Because I know what trying to study theory under the stresses of housing insecurity and poverty is like, the scholarship was set up during the first month of operation. Simply fill it out at https://theory-underground.com/scholarship.
Last but not least, stay tuned for the Theory Underground app, coming soon to an app store near you, on your phone.
Yeah, and seriously, thank you for listening or watching to this point, and yeah,
Thanks.
we look forward to taking these courses with you.
Bye.